Hi, everyone, and sorry for the delay. Welcome to the Division of Landscape Architecture series titled Assembling Futures, which focus on the idea of future practices, especially on the role of landscape and heritage in shaping our environmental futures. This is the last lecture of our series. Over the past weeks, lecture discussions have already raised many interesting questions, such as how do we value, manage, design, and imagine the future? How has climate change made us rethink ideas of nature and culture? And how do different projects enact different future scenarios and construct realities? Most importantly, we have also been questioning what kind of knowledge is needed to ensure that the alternative futures being created today, especially achieving environmental and social justice. Today, we are honored to welcome Günther Vogt to join us and to conclude this series. Günther is a prominent Swiss landscape architect, educator, and author. He founded Vogt Landscape Architects in 2000 in Zurich, and today has offices in London, Berlin, and Paris. In 2010, Vogt Case Study Studio opened in Zurich, and it is an office which serves as a platform for non-commercial work and research, exhibitions, and debates. Günther's background in horticulture, combined with his studies at the University of Applied Science in Rupperswil with Peter Ernie and Jörg Alther and Dieter Kienast, is a foundation that can still be traced in much of his work. Vogt's work is of international importance. Their work is characterized by its work across scales and also for the way it finds the dialect between different disciplines and its close cooperation with artists and architects such as Olafur Eliasson, Herzog and de Meuron, and Peter Sumter. His projects include seminal works such as the Tate Modern in London, the Allianz Arena in Munich, and the Masoala Rainforest Hall in Zurich at the Zurich Zoo, and here in Hong Kong, the M+ Museum Garden. Since 2005, Günther has pursued a combination of teaching, practice, and research as a professor and chair at the Institute of Landscape Architecture at ETH Zurich. He is the editor and author of multiple books, including Distance and Engagement and Mutation and Morphosis. In 2012, he was a visiting professor at Harvard Graduate School of Design, and in the same year, he received the Prix Meret Oppenheim from the Federal Office of Culture. In 2018, he was awarded an honorary doctorate by the University of Liechtenstein. So please join in welcoming Günther Vogt to Hong Kong University tonight. You have the microphone. You want to have a microphone?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you, first of all, for the invitation. Thank you for the introduction. Perhaps it's a bit, it's important that I explain a little bit, besides all these biographical things, where I'm coming from. I was socialized by architects. So you have to understand Swiss architects in those days, they always designed the so-called Swiss box, rectangular. And then, of course, all out of concrete. They get really nervous if it comes to the question, is it light or middle grade, the concrete? But this is changing now. The last 2 years in architecture, there's a lot of change. And many architects are, in the past, it was always important, no trees in front of our building. We all want to see our building. And now, green, green, green. So we are really in a time of change, and that's important to understand. When I'm saying landscape as a process, somebody was super important for me, and unfortunately there are only 2 books in English, Lucius Burkhardt, who published books such as Destroyed by Maintenance, Chronology, The Science of Walking, and so on. He really learned us how to perceive landscape. That was super important, and he was the professor of Valin and Roger Diner, all this famous generation. in the beginning, and he was originally a sociologist, but he was teaching design. And that was for me super important. That will be the next book, unfortunately only in German, an anthology of landscape. Where are the important texts in relation to landscape from the Bible till today? And it's super important to see the roots of his theory, and he was really important for us as students. Landscape as process, I will come back to it. What's really important, since we work a lot with architects, of course, and with artists. We are not artists, we are not architects, we are landscape architects. This is a good friend of us, Hamish Fulton. He studied with Richard Long in the UK art, and he's just walking in the landscape, not taking anything out of the landscape, but then walking, perceiving landscape, and then in his studio producing artwork, such as this piece of art where he explained land art doesn't exist anymore. It's my theory, by the way, that it disappeared with Robert Smith and Gordon Matta Clark in 1973. And since then, we shouldn't, it wasn't a move, sorry, it was a movement in the US, and it's really related to this time, for me at least. I can imagine that the art historians see it different. But what's really important is that we are not artists, therefore we can work with artists. And that's really much more important. After tomorrow, I will discuss with the curators at the Plus about our collaboration with the artists. And now I come to this position, and since there are many students here, you don't have to take my position over, but you have to find during your study or in the next year, what is your position? Because nowadays, and I saw it on your drawings, the expression nature is everywhere. And especially architects are constantly talking about nature. I never talk about nature. I mean, we changed nature to landscape, and since then we only have landscape. It is a cultural landscape, an urban landscape, whatever it is. But I think we shouldn't use the term nature in our discipline. This is really definitely, and I will come back, why I'm saying it's not existing anymore. And I know some students in Copenhagen was really aggressive when I said it, and when I explained. I mean, you know, the Waldsterben, so the forest dying in the 1980s in Europe. And I was on the street doing manifestation against this acid rain. And we said, yeah, in 2020, we will have 50% less forests in Europe. In reality, we have 50% more. And that had to, the acid rain stopped because the coal mine were closed, and abandonment of the landscape and the forest coming. So it's not so clear always. Your position can change in the future. And I think when I'm saying what is landscape or urban landscape, you see here the very famous example, the city here, the city wall, and the landscapes, the agrarian landscape outside. It was a clear division between where is the city and where is the landscape. If it would be a bit bigger, you would see, by the way, that inside the city are only women working, besides 2 craftsmen on the roof. So the city is a female introduction in Europe. That's super important. And you see our offices here. And then I say, what is a cultural landscape? This is a river coming from the lake. It's like a park in the middle of Zurich. And this river is coming from outside, from the landscape. So the day before there was a heavy rain. So this color relates to the landscape, and this color relates to the city. And that's really important that we learn to discuss among us, first of all, and afterwards with the public. The problem is, when I'm talking about landscape, and saying it's not nature. Landscape is always a cultural production. Therefore, there are some architects here. For architects, it's much easier to build a high-rise building in Hong Kong, in New York, in Zurich, wherever. Landscape is not so easy. It's not a climate, different climate here or in Zurich. It's a cultural production. It's not the same. I've seen the gardens in Guangzhou. I mean, this is a cultural production on the top from another time. And therefore, we really have to discuss it. And I saw many of your projects, it's going, I think, in the right way. Nevertheless, I'm many times asked, so our clients, and especially the architects, they all want to have green facades, and it has to be sustainable, photovoltaic. It's getting dense in our cities. That's a real problem. We have the first projects in Europe where we cannot plant a tree on the ground floor because it's full, facilities, parking, and so on. But it should look like nature, and that's for me, especially these green facades. We get more and more regulation, and it makes building houses, even social housing, really expensive with all these regulations. That's a real problem. The same people asking for cheap housing. It has all to be super green everywhere. And believe me, especially on the roofs, it's getting dense with the photovoltaic, nature, technique, and so on. And it always has consequences of what we are doing. And this, for instance, is FIFA, the World Football Association, the headquarters in Zurich. They wanted to have from all continents landscapes around their headquarters. As you know, that's not really easy to have Hong Kong climate in Zurich without a greenhouse. So we proposed an open to the roof, a forest type from Canada, northwest US, where you have this rainforest, but with snow and freezing, and with famous mammoth trees. And what's really interesting is this is just an image, and people working there, they don't know that these trees are fake because they cannot touch it. Meanwhile, they are overgrown with moss, but they cannot go closer than 3 meters. What's really interesting for me, they don't realize that they park their car 5 stories under this forest. And since the trunks are 3 meters thick, they really believe it's an old forest. So, and where are the mammoth trees coming from? But they construct in the brain what they see, what they perceive in an image. But now I'm always asked, what is the most beautiful landscape for you? And the explanation is very easy. Where we are not allowed, where we are excluded. And I'll just show you one example. This is a seed bank in northern Norway, where human beings believe that we can collect all seeds worldwide, and then we have a bank, and then we can do it. But what's really interesting, we have, you can imagine, in relation to your, a lot of rice from all over the world. But for instance, the Mexican native people, they don't allow the seed bank to take maize or corn as a seed, because they say it's not just the seed, it's our culture. And I think that's really interesting. And it's deep frozen for, I don't know, 15, 20 years. But the problem is the glacier is melting. So it's no longer so deep frozen. So the world is changing. And we have this idea of the island, what Lucius Burkhardt always described. It's a band. This is the island, the Ascension Island. Darwin passed by with a ship. And then he saw this island completely covered by moss. And he thought, yeah, but it could be much nicer. Let's ask Kew Botanical Garden to plant trees from both sides. That means from South America, from here, and from South. So we have a new biotope created by botanists. And if you would go there, it looks really nice, beautiful, but it's not really nature. It's I would say it's a park, because these trees are never grown together, because they're growing on both sides of this continent. And that's really interesting with the island. And when I'm saying excluded, it's very easy. Here we are excluded. And all the wildlife is coming back. And if you see all the photos done by drones, it's unbelievable. The wildlife in the city center of Grenoble is meanwhile a forest which is completely overgrown, or starts to be completely overgrown. But that means we are excluded. We are not part of this paradise idea anymore. Therefore, it really works. And one of the most beautiful landscapes in Europe is in eastern Poland, Belarus. It was a beautiful forest 500 years ago, and the kings of Poland and the Russian Tsars didn't allow the farmers to cut a tree or to hunt an animal. And therefore, it looks like in the medieval times. So again, since we are excluded, it works as a so-called beautiful nature. But you can imagine they find already now new species due to the radioactivity. There's also birch trees, and all these trees create new varieties. It already started very fast that we will have, I don't know, 20, 30 years, new species and new forests. So, and what is really changing, and how does it influence our discipline? So this is in architecture, the so-called first house, where you have the roof, textiles around for the walls, but the most important is black dot in the middle. So we learned to control the fire in the house, and this was really important in a cultural evolution. Umberto Eco is saying Europe has grown because we had beans, and the beans is protein, and then started cultural evolution. It has to do with food, and that's really interesting. And you can cook food, but then we had this urbanization, as you know it. It's very strong, and as you know, in every congress I hear in the future 50% of the world population will live in cities. Then my question is to you as landscape architect, what happens with the landscape? Nobody is talking about what happens with the landscape. And for instance, in Europe, when I started at CETH, I asked the EU research group, can you give us a map of abandoned landscapes in Europe? They couldn't. So we produced it ourselves. And you can't believe how many landscapes in Europe are completely abandoned. And this is in relation to this movement of the population into the city. But what happens? Then when we say this population is living in the cities, we have two real questions for landscape architecture in the future. This is also burning landscape of this very hot summer in 2018, and you see it worldwide. And what's really interesting, for instance, on your part of the world and in Siberia, for instance, these are marshlands, no longer frozen, so that it's and then the fire is coming. So instead of collecting CO2 from the atmosphere, these landscapes are producing CO2, and that's even worse than and you see the dimension. It's amazing. The potential to collect CO2 is amazing, but as you can see, the dimension of producing CO2, and then this is so-called natural production. And since I'm coming from from Europe, I show you the question of the water. And the real problem is, you see the light blue, these are the biggest glacier in Europe. And it will disappear in 70, 80 years from now. But it's not only disappearing. Underneath is a topography, a landscape with lakes. The dark blues are the lake coming up in the next 70, 80 years, so-called natural lakes. And now the question to the landscape architects for me is, what happens with this lake? Because it will show you. Doesn't work. So it's underneath this glacier are protected landscape, marshlands, highest protection in Switzerland. So we can, of course, say now we have water, but these lakes will partly disappear because of the landslide coming down and fills the lakes up. That means it's the most dynamic landscape in Switzerland is above 1,800 meters. And my problem is that our discipline has no answer. What happens with this landscape? And then we are talking in Switzerland 2 degrees higher in temperature, but in the Alps it's 5 degrees. 5 degrees means it's a lot. Water is one aspect. The forests are between 1,800 and 2,000 in Switzerland. And per degree, the forest is going up 100 meters. So that means we will have forests on 2,500. But is it just forest? Is it a park? How do we deal with it? And the new image will be, instead of having white Alps, as you can expect in Switzerland with snow, we will have gray mountains, and afterwards it's becoming green. So that means a completely different perception of the same landscape. But we have to do something. And Switzerland will have one of the only countries in Europe will have in the end of 2100 enough water. The problem is not at the right time. That means the glaciers are no longer there. The snow is no longer there. Then we have water, and the water is so fast running as here in Hong Kong through. So that means we will have to build huge reservoir to have drinking water or multifunctional lakes to produce hydropower, drinking water, irrigation water, whatever. And that's the real question in the future. And this dimension is big. And we are working with our students. How does this lake look like? I mean, it's nice to have some mirrors, gray mountains, but in the end, it's really to have enough drinking water in the future. And believe me, the energy that we are currently discussing all over the world is such a problem. Drinking water is really a question in the future. And this has a lot to do with our landscape. So now, and by the way, you can all discuss these statements I'm doing here if you don't agree. That's again with Lucius Burkhardt. He said design is invisible, and I'm saying ecology is invisible. My students are always saying, you know, ecologically it's right or wrong. And then I said, we cannot say it's right or wrong because of the ecology. We can say, I find it right or wrong. The ecology is just describing what's going on. So in Chernobyl, the ecology is just describing what's happening inside. It's not saying it's good or bad. This impetus is coming from us, not from the ecology. And so I show you some a very small project in Zurich, a small hotel where we did a little project, and that's I just show one photo. And when you look at it, and I would ask you, you would say it's birch forest. And so many times asked, what is this? What is behind it? And it's obvious, it's a birch forest. And then it's, I would say, more than 100 magazine, newspapers, it's constantly photographed and produced. And I ask you now, why? It's very easy. It's so-called supernature. It's a birch forest many people know from the landscape, and it's super urban. And by the way, we got the prize for natural protection, whatever. They didn't see this. It's on a parking garage. These trees have only 80 centimeters of soil. So it's super artificial, but the image looks super natural again. And that's the perception we have today, that we overlap this loose gravel and the forest image. And we quite often work like that, where we keep it super direct and super simple. But it can be very complex. Then center again with Herzog tomorrow. Looks like that. So first of all, you don't see any tree. The reason is this little bird, because oops, the black red star. If you would plant trees, crows would attack this bird. Okay, no trees. So the next is that whole soil, thousands of cubic meters, completely contaminated. So we cannot take it away and clean it. So we can move it on the side, but it would cost more than the theater to clean it. So, but if you have lawn on top, then it's possible. And the bird's nesting is here on top, on loose gravel. So it's super ecological, but it doesn't look like. So you have to know what you see. And of course, we did census amphitheater out of lawn, what you can only do in the UK. First of all, because of the climate, it's constantly raining. And then that's good for the lawn. And the English people want to touch grass. They have an erotic relationship with grass, not benches or chairs, grass. They have to touch grass. So therefore, we had to introduce in front of the Tate. We started with a kind of Mediterranean plaza, but it has to be grass in front. It's so expensive to keep it. As you can imagine, these millions of visitors constantly walking on the grass, so they have to extend changes at least 2 times a year. But of course, it looks super artificial, and I'm sometimes asked, is this a rendering or is it a real photo? It is a real photo, but it looks, since the English grass is so poisonous green, and but in the end, it's to cover the poisonous soil. And of course, people are using it, and for them, it's not dangerous. But it's one of the most ecological, so-called ecological projects we ever did. So now I'll show you another scale. Since I was talking about the Alps, this is for us the eco space for our project. It's Milan, Switzerland, Germany, Austria, Italy, France, and so on. It's a very important eco space for us. And the question is really, and we did it with the students, there are all the big cities are around this landscape of the Alps. And we did semester design in every of this city. What is the relationship between the city of Milan to this landscape, and not a park, but a landscape, and it's not a central park behind. And super important for us, how do you feed this city? I mean, in Milan, you have completely different foods, and in Marseille, or it's an elective course, we say it's urban food. How do you feed the city? First of all, the production is a landscape, the distribution, and then the food itself, and the recycling, and so on. And we, by the way, a very good book by Caroline Steele, How to Feed a City. And I asked her once, but what is, all this urban gardening and urban farming, what is the right scale? And then she said, it's a middle scale, it's very easy. But Günther, the problem is the middle scale in London is not the same as in Zurich. You have to find it out, and it's super interesting to talk about food when we work with landscape. So this was a competition with OMA, Remy Koolhaas. The city of Milan had, or the railway company in Milan had two big properties in Milan, and they wanted to develop it. And that's now coming. It's what is really new. One side is 100% green, as it is, no building. The other side, 60% green, and the rest 30% green. So you can imagine a lot of green. These are bad experiences with urban planning in the past. It's always coming at the end. And what I really like, what is new, is this interdisciplinary aspect. So it's not the urban planning, the architects, the landscape architects. And our team are 12 specialists. For instance, how to clean the soil and so on. And what we found out, what was super important for us, that there is a topography in Milan. The north is 7-8 meters higher, and the south is completely flat, where it's the rice production of the Po River. And then we found out everywhere we look at it, it's so related to water. It's not a culture. You don't really see it, but you have all these channels by Leonardo da Vinci, and of course many, like all over the world. These rivers are now under the street and not present anymore. And so we decided, okay, let's have a program for this two sides, completely different, since it's the client is asking for it. And what is the relationship between these two? And this was in all Italian newspapers, that we said in the north, you have the industrial part, it's industry, car, furniture design, and in the south, it's agriculture, and mainly rice. And you see all this river system as a way. Here is an airport, an early airport from the 1920s, as the airplanes landed on water, and now they don't know what to do. For me, it's a beautiful park. But so we related to the whole water system existing in Milan, so that people have a cultural relationship. So the water airport, the canals, and of course, it's this not so dense urbanization. And that's very close to the city center. This is where you see still enough to build for architects, as you can see. And here we do a cleaning system for the contaminated soil for the next 30 years. Very, very soft system. And a lot of green, you could say. It's a kind of forest. And the other part is completely free of building or urbanization. What you see here in the middle is a never finished railway station by the famous architect Aldo Rossi. So we propose to keep it and transform it into a small education center for education about this landscape. And what you see on the right-hand side is the canal by Leonardo da Vinci, and our proposal on the left, a really big water feature. And it's, of course, it's always for us important. It's not only the aesthetic and this presence of water, let's say. The water here is coming from Switzerland, as you can imagine, super clean. And it goes over the border, 30 kilometers north. But here, the question is, they have to fence it off. When you fall in, either you're poisoned or you're drunken. So you can choose. And so we propose to have a water cleaning system as well, and not only an aesthetic. So this multifunctional use or that landscape can do than more than one thing. So in Hamburg, a transformation could be in Hong Kong as well. Again, a competition with Herzog and de Meuron. Yeah, perhaps you know this project was a Hafen city in Hamburg, and it's I would say this kind of big events. I always have a problem with these expos and all these big events because they are not really interesting. But now they want to do a so-called digital city. Don't ask me what the digital city is, but it's new that, and of course you see it's one master plan, and it's really an interdisciplinary work with architects, traffic planner, and so on. And what we respected the different sides and the different qualities. So, and quite often in European projects, we deal with typologies of what is a park, what is a plaza, what is public and what is private, what is, for instance, in the UK, very difficult and very different. My French and my English colleagues, they are constantly like that because landscape and paysage, it's a completely different understanding. So we proposed different promenades and a park in the center. But what was really important to respect what is already there. So these are the different typologies. And again, a real problem in Europe, in many cities like in Hong Kong, so for instance, Lisbon or Copenhagen, they have a double problem. So that means the water is coming from the land side because of it's all urbanized, and the water is coming very fast, and it's coming from the seaside. So they really have a problem with flood. And in the time we worked for Hamburg, the level is more than 1 meter higher than this stuff. So the high water level. Meanwhile, they have to accept that it will be flooded sometimes. It's just not possible. So otherwise, we have to rebuild the whole city. But we took an example, what they already know. You see it in section underneath that we introduced an extra level where cars were parked, by the way. And if the flood is coming, the people are warned, you have to take your car out or your car is flooded. So if they accept, and we have to accept in the future, this landscape risks, let's say, for instance, in the Mediterranean, more than 100 UNESCO sites will disappear because of the flood. So it will change completely this historical and cultural landscape. And we are meanwhile on the level where we have certain damages, we have to accept the risk. We are living in a risk society. That cannot change it, and you cannot make it like in the 60s, everything working. And now I'm coming to the idea landscape as a process, and sometimes you say landscape as a model and the model as a landscape. And I was very happy to see in some university lately that you still build physical models. And of course, you don't have so much space as my students, they don't have more space. And I agree, it's a very difficult question because first of all, you don't have enough space at home or at the university to store it. And then landscape models are wider than architectural models. But we are luckily have a lot of space. This model is more than 12 meters long and 1.8 meters wide. And you can only use it 1 or 2 times, then you have mid-critiques or final critique. We use this model for 6 years now. And we're constantly changing, adapting all the changes. We constantly use it. And that's therefore, as a working method, it's very good. And if you leave the university, don't forget that the physical models are much faster. And believe me, I'm so many times in juries, I always see these landscape drawings. It's always 2-dimensional. It's not thought as a space. But here it's obvious, and you can control it, the view axis, you can control the masking. You shouldn't lose this this tradition you learn here. And perhaps you have one time more space, but it's a special technology. So how it looks like. Yeah, this is so that's what we can. Yeah, this roof is very long and very wide. This, you know, nowadays you see it in the harbor here in Hong Kong. We have containers, but before the containers, the ship were arriving here, loading all the goods under the roof. And we wanted to keep this together with Herzog and de Meuron, in addition to the new park for the city, to keep this roof, and not only as a, let's say, as a romantic reference to the old use of the harbor. It's more question today. There is a public space. I just saw this building by Norman Foster. And this is a beautiful public space. And this is, I mean, if you see the Tate Modern in London, the Turbine Hall, the ramp leading down, or the Turbine Hall itself, is a public space. And that's a really interesting question. And we think it should not only be a traditional plaza or park or boulevard. We can here, it's given, it's a roof, but in the future, I think we should really think, can public space be part of the building or the architecture? I know it's very difficult. I've just explained before. You know, the high-rises in New York, they were in the 60s. They were not a street, but a bit setback. Then you have the mirror pool and the lobby, and the lobby was part of the plaza as well. And now, due to security, it's difficult. But in this future, we should really think what, by the way, what is public space for you? I can tell you my definition. You don't have to take it over. 24 hours accessible, no CCTV cameras, drinking water for free, and you can sit down. The main railway station in Zurich, there are 8 seats for millions of visitors, and if you're waiting, you cannot sit down. And if you would have drinking water all over the world, in every public space, you would change the world. So now, last one, heritage. I worked together with Peter Zumthor. Again, in this is the red line is the definition what the Alps are, Marseille, Lyon, Milan, and we are really at the edge of the Alps and the urbanized area in Zurich. And as you can imagine, it's a beautiful landscape. But the question, since I heard that you're dealing with heritage, we have really a problem in Europe. If there is any beautiful landscape, it's immediately protected. And then you have the protection, but nobody knows, but what is in 20 years from now? For instance, Germany is more or less a national park. It's all protected. In Switzerland, people are protesting that they want to live in a national park or regional park, whatever. So it should be, we should have landscape development project. In which way, when it's something changes like this abandonment and the reforestation, how do we deal with this question in the future and not just protection? And then what you see from this park is exactly this view, what Turner did. He did a red, a blue, and a rosa Rigi. And I read the text he was writing. In Switzerland, everything is beautiful. And, you know, and especially here, topography is like a landscape park in England. But the problem is the twin light. So in the evening, when it's getting dark, in the UK, you have this wonderful light and changing the color. And I never saw it. Well, one time I saw it in Switzerland. It's really, it's not fake. It is like that, what he means with this English landscape. And so, and this, what is really interesting, you see also red dots. These are parks, really big parks along the lake, only on this side. And it's only on this side because the topography is so interesting. And so we propose to see all the gardens together as a landscape. And that's really a question in the future. How do we deal with this? Because nobody really knows what to do with this part. The government is not interested to keep it because it's just maintenance cost. But what are you doing with these parks? And this is a learning center then with together with Günther and for Novartis. Now it looks from above. And on top right, you see these mountains in the background with an architectonic garden in the middle ground. And our job was more to be a partner for the architect. There are positions for buildings in here, so in the, I don't know, 50 hotel rooms and the meeting point and the restaurant and so on. So, and this is the existing, and we propose to take this architectonic garden also, it has nothing to do with this landscape. And then, and we did a lot of you see it here, black and white photos from professional black and white photos for us to look on this photo. What is really interesting to have a kind of perception. And then, of course, different trees. Again, it was a fashion in these old days, really big solitary trees where we said, okay, one should keep it. It's a history of the garden. But we would like to have this existing villa to take away. It's 90 meters above the lake, but we shouldn't see buildings from the lake or from outside. They should all disappear. And in the end, we got it so that you wouldn't see any building from outside. And you see, it's a lot of details that in the end, it will be a completely new park. But with smaller interventions and smaller changes on the left-hand side, that's Peter Zumthor would still like to have it, but he will not get it. This is explained our project. We have the hill here, a valley, and we found out in this meadow there are small water really from a small river, and it's a delta. And as we said, it's our concept is the hill, the delta, and the valley. And his proposal is, you see it in this sketch on the right-hand side. Buildings are not touching the ground, so all the buildings are on pilotis and 5 meters above ground. And what you see out of the hotel rooms is really into the forest, and it's 5-6 meters above ground, and the meadows are underneath, and it's more a landscape. It's less a park as it is today. So for you to understand this perfectionism, this is a one-to-one mock-up from inside of what our hotel room, what you would see from inside out, how we constructed it. So you have a perception of this new landscape. And of course, we changed the whole landscape, but in the 5-10 years, you wouldn't see it, how these different meadows and the different intervention we did. And a lot of studies about this delta again. And that's a final drawing. So finally, it's no longer a park, it's a landscape. And that's our idea. If people are coming here from all over the world to be trained, they have really an experience of the landscape with the lake in the foreground, the hills in the middle ground, and the mountains in the background. And again, a lot of models, we did endless models with Günther. So this is the last one. It's a bit slow. It's again from Novartis in Basel. As they transformed, you see it in the back, it's a chemical industrial area. And they transformed this area from a chemical production into a research campus and all the things related to research they wanted to have here or concentrate here. One is in Shanghai, one is in Basel, one is two are in the US. And this is the starting point, and we will discuss it with students about material tomorrow. And then the beginning was a young architect coming from the UK into our office asking me, why are the pebble stones in Basel so different? Like here, and she did this collection, and it's here really beautiful. And that's the explanation. Here, the river is coming from here. Basel is up here. So the river brings all the geology from the different landscapes in Switzerland to one point. And this was really the starting point for the design. So, and there I would really ask you, you should have students. My students are doing a lot of research in the internet and so on. You should start to build your own library. So we have in our office a library of different cities in Europe. So for instance, we are constantly working in Basel, in Hamburg, and so on. Why should we always throw away? And I mean, for this project, I could fill 2 books like this, only the research. And many times I'm asked in Europe, but how is it possible to work like that? Because we can constantly relate to our former research. And we started 1 year ago that we have our own city library. And you should never throw your material away. In 3 years, you think, I had something, and then you don't find it anymore. You have to create your own library, your own archive. Why I'm saying this, it's really just one example. What we found out here is that there are terraces growing up in the campus down here, and it's related to the river Rhine, of course, because it was not letters and the terrace. But what was really interesting was this cutting. You see it in the landscape here, or and in the city, it was more or less destroyed. And we found out this could be as a spatial element coming from the landscape. Very interesting. So these cuttings, and it took us around 8-9 months to find out how do we build these cuttings. And we were a lot in the landscape, and the design, the river is on the right hand side. The formal design of 2D is very easy. It's not so interesting to have these drawings. But of course, there's always in Switzerland. When you ever come to Switzerland, you only see 40%, 60% are underneath. And of course, here it's a car parking. And so we wanted to have this embankment near the river and to bring the river back to where it was before, even if it's now flat, since it's a car park. It's completely flat. But then we built this, and there is a lot of material research behind, of course, how to build it and then to destroy it. And in the end, it looks like so. And it's a wonderful trick, by the way, because it's flat. People going to the park are constantly saying they are going down to the river. They're not going down. It's only because the terraces are like this, and then they have feeling they are going down. They're not going down completely flat. So, and how it looks in layers behind. And this you can only build in Switzerland. So health and safety regulation. And I saw here as well, there is this fence, but in Europe it's impossible to build. And then I had a discussion with the health and safety officer, and he looked at me and said, but you know, Switzerland is a dangerous landscape. They have to learn to deal with it. Okay, it's 3.5 meters higher, so to fall down. Then he proposed, yeah, you have lawn, but in the real end, a bit of meadow, and then people see it's changing, and it's a bit difficult and dangerous. But it's only in Switzerland. And that was the reason, by the way, and again, it has a lot. I don't know why I found it out. It's because the boss of Novartis told me these people working in research, they don't want to work as you, or we all find these old industrial areas very interesting. It's part of the plants here and so on. But the British want to touch the grass. And so they really needed in this former industrial area a park. And that was for us really interesting to deal with it. We did for the European Central Bank in Frankfurt such a project. And I really thought, how can we deal again, many British people against the British? And so we did a park or a landscape around without footpaths. So you have really to walk in the landscape with not like on footpath. And so it took some months until people left Sahara's willing to go for lunch into this landscape because there is no footpath. But afterwards, people told me it was so impressive to leave a high-rise building, to leave the office space, and then to be in a landscape for, let's say, half an hour or an hour. So that's it. If you have any questions or discussion or critiques, I'm open.
So we're going to start before we go into questions with a short discussion between Ivan Valin. He's the head of the Division of Landscape Architecture. And also an associate professor in practice. So we'll just have like a discussion.
Yeah, we can have a seat.
And then we'll open to questions. I think just
well, I'm happy to see students in the audience and professionals from around Hong Kong. Thank you very much for your talk. I hope everyone in the audience was moved by something that they saw. I only have maybe one question that the audience. You guys have some questions of your own. I don't want to take too much of my own time, but as a way of kind of wrapping up the lecture series, which is about landscape futures, I wanted to kind of quickly go through some of the things we discussed here in this room. And it's mixed these ideas of conservation, heritage, with ideas of design. And it kind of struck me that the name of the lecture series is Assembling Futures. Right? So it's sort of thinking that there's going to be an answer about how we future as landscape architects. We've learned about how we need to see the world around us, what we need to appreciate, looking at humans, but also non-humans, looking at systems in the landscape, water systems, looking at time, looking at scale when we're thinking about conserving landscapes, building those conservation lands within a larger landscape over time. Future as part of the heritage. We've also heard from designers about how to work. We work in the world with accelerators. And I think you add to that this notion of what we do. You said we have to do something. You said this a couple of times in your lecture. So in this kind of constellation of ideas about how we create the future, I'm curious how you navigate what you described as a difficulty of not difficulty, but the challenge of working across cultures, you know, this the challenge of generations, that working with students, but also practice ideas of how we should work. Curious how you navigate ethics, personal ethics, or your office ethics.
Yes, that's a real problem. I mean, to work in different cities in Europe, it's okay, but you know, especially in London, people are coming from Canada, US, China, Europe, and my role is a bit to establish a common platform, so that we're all talking about the same, because they're still very young and they did a completely different background. And sometimes all these misunderstandings are coming from this different background and culture. That's not so easy, and that's really I have to do it with the French and the English. It's possible, but they hate each other. They have a completely different understanding of what landscape is and what landscape means. I mean, the French idea of rational sources is for British people like that. And then the English is for the French a bit romantic, and it's constantly on this level. But with all the others, even from people from North America or China, it's much easier. They are much more open-minded. And my problem was in the past, we have, when I was a student, I was constantly complaining, why are we not working on the bigger scale? And it was just, in Europe, we say landscape planning, but for the architects among you, I would say it was zoning. So for the landscape and measuring the landscape. So we had to measure landscape from 1 to 10. This is bad and this is good. And a number for a landscape, what is good and what is bad. We don't have a discussion culture, and now it's coming. The problem is that many landscape architects in Europe are not so interested in this scale. And what I found out is that my architectural students, they are much more interested, and without any knowledge coming to our semester, no background in the bachelor in landscape, they are immediately able to understand the scale, because architects have first in the bachelor to learn the scale of a city, for instance, or let's say to read the city and so on. I just mentioned this afternoon in the current semester, we have a student from China. She's an expert in hydrology, but she didn't do one lesson in hydrology. But she found out this is super important, because if I propose this scale, this landscape, I really have to know what I'm proposing. So otherwise it's not serious. And I'm completely against this protection, because we should really have a concept for future development, and it can change. The climate is changing, the culture is changing, but we should have an idea of what could be a future development in 20, 30 years. We can adapt it or change it. And we look too static on landscape. It's much more dynamic when I see, especially in the last 2, 3, 4 years, it's a climate change. And so it's not the end, it will be much more than that in the future.
I want to sneak in one more question, because I noticed on your slides, some of them have the label for landscape architects, and some have the label Professor G. Vogt. You who operate in both worlds, what do you gain from each side? What maybe talk about your practice? How does teaching personally inform you?
First of all, I mean, that's not my, normally it's called folk, and in Paris, I say in typical French, landscape and urbanism. So I said, are we urbanists? Yes. She's in Paris. That's the reason why we established this case studio, because I have two bosses now. I'm no longer the boss. They are doing all the business, and I'm just for critiques and bring up new ideas. They told me, if you leave the university, then something is missing. Content, right? Content is coming to the work you're doing here on my students. They are meanwhile they don't build buildings out of concrete. And when I remember, Swiss box, light and middle gray, concrete, but they are telling me that this is no longer possible. And then I can have a discussion with them. And of course, they have another problem. Of course, yeah, one of the most important resources is sand for concrete. But then I told them, now you need to build out of wood. You know? Do you know what the consequences for the landscape? No. In Iceland, I was there 20 years ago, the first time I counted around five trees. The rest is mostly grass. And now, instead of farms, sheep farms, they're planting forests. Do you really want to have forests on Iceland? These are the consequences, and we have to discuss it. And this is coming from this, especially now, of course, they're super critical, and then we will perhaps discuss tomorrow. I have one student who is now doing his master. Then he proposes to build buildings out of earth, around earth. And Zurich, for instance, if you do an excavation, you can just build a house of 4 or 5 levels, no problem. But why is CPH not doing it? Only tests a small pavilion, but we have the technology. It's 200 or 300 years old. It's coming from this building. You know? So what is? I mean, we all have to find out new material and new techniques, and this is coming from the university. And a lot of input. I cannot always specify what is coming from there or not. But sometimes the students are asking me some question. On such a question, we start to do something or in an exhibition, and so not enough landscape architects are doing exhibitions, for instance. So we are doing like architects, you know, this is project 1, project 2, and then drawings on the board. Yeah, but I'm interested what the students are asking me, what is behind your project. I mean, the design and so on is all okay, but what is behind your project or your thinking? That thinking is, but I have to say more from the students in my case and from the rest of the universities.
Good. Okay, so maybe we hear from some of the students. We have mics. You can also use mine. For colleagues, remember, there's a few provocative statements here in the beginning. Nature is dead.
maybe that was next. Everyone I think probably agrees with that. It doesn't exist. It's by landscape. The Anthropocene is also gone. Finished.
Yeah, it's a Parisian, what I'm saying. It's like, I mean, how arrogant a human being is. I mean, they only have this expression for geological time. Now we say we are a geological.
I just had a question about this. We're talking about where is paradise today, and you stated that paradise is where humans are not allowed. And I don't know if that's your opinion or what society thinks paradise is. And I was just curious, within Hong Kong, where there's so many people, I was just curious as to how, what do you think about paradise within Hong Kong? Or like, because I know that you're saying that that nature does not exist anymore, and then you kind of brought that further into saying that we believe that that these pristine landscapes. Yes. So I'm just curious as to what the continuation of that statement is within the context. So it's kind of a roundabout question.
The discussion with Pierre Dumeron, and I told them, yeah, I'm coming here, and so on. Sitting and the mountains are so close, not like in Switzerland, 300 kilometers really out of the. And therefore, when I arrived here, and on the second time here, I said, I took a trick for this ecosystem hall in the zoo in Zurich. You know, I mean, you can. I learned in the school you can destroy rainforest; it's never coming back. You cannot, but we did it. But how can you explain it? So the name is Mazuara forest, not Madagascar. Nobody knows what Mazuara is. But the trick is, it's like here, you create a horizon. It's a promise behind it. We did a wonderful book. It's not only outside. What I found, for instance, super interesting for me is the topo, not only the staircase running up. It's crazy for me. But the topo, let's say, an enormous street with shops, and then in the end, there is a promise behind. There is something, otherwise it wouldn't go out like this. So how I read it, and sometimes today it was a bit foggy, but then you see like a promise, and then this horizon is only, I don't know, very tense. I don't know the geography exactly, but it's a kind of this horizon is really interesting. And of course, it's my interpretation. So I only see what people find beautiful, like this forest in Poland. The Polish didn't like it. They wanted to cut the trees, and then the Germans came. No more money for the Polish if you cut the trees. And so it's protected. And now all tourists are going there because it was in the newspaper constantly. This is worth to keep it. This is beautiful. And I think it's coming out of such a discussion. But you don't think if you're excluded somehow, it's precious. Because you cannot go in, you are excluded. So then it's really precious. But I don't think we should make it so exclusive. But by the way, I saw a small paradise in Hong Kong as well. And it's together with the climate, the humidity, the rain, the birds, and just behind a very dense urban city. There are small things for me very interesting, and the presence of the city around is perhaps part of the problem. Makes it much more beautiful because you have this climate, these plants, the birds, and so on. But then you see hierarchy in the background, but your body is, you are in this purpose, but outside is inside and outside. So it's really interesting.
Thank you for the lecture. I'd like to ask what was the differences you mentioned between the British landscape and the French paysage? Like there was a debate. Would you explain a little bit more about it?
Yeah, perhaps I can start with my cultural background. For instance, a German Landschaft means a political administrative unit. It's political administrative for a land, but it's not. Paysage is more related to agriculture. I mean, if you are outside Marseille, there is a point. It's 621 kilometers and 250 meters to Paris. So Paris is the center, it's all measured, and it's about measuring the landscape. But this comes from the agriculture. Finally, where you have this ownership, the parcel, and the British landscape is coming. I mean, the English landscape park or garden is not created by architects or landscape architects, but by artists. And by the way, they should have an older example since the English have in this tradition, wherever it's coming from. But nowadays we are saying it's coming from painters. So I mean, they even moved villages on the land, 300 people, to have perfect view and no borders. That's super important. You know? So when you see it in the English landscape garden, if you know this aha, or if you don't see a fence or a border fence, and it's an exchange between the landscape behind and the landscape sets. But look at Versailles. They create a border, no? So instead of, they have a forest, but in front of the forest, they plant 6 rows of trees. So from the king, it looks like, yeah, it's all controlled, but it only looks like, but it's a control of the landscape. But in the Italian paisaggism, again, something else, and then I need a bit more time. And again, for me, it's only interesting because it's a cultural production, and the differences are very present. So when you see the most famous English gardens, then you see pavilion looking like a Palladio architecture, and then you see a pagode. Nowadays, people visiting in the UK, such gardens, they don't understand the codes. The Palladio is relating to new political system in Italy. The pagode is relating to the border of the so-called empire. So the border is outside the garden, even over the ocean. And so we don't understand these codes today. That's a bit the problem. So, but it's still very present. It's, yeah.
Oh, yes, hi, thank you so much for the wonderful talk. I'm an architect and I also teach history here. So I think when we talk about time, we talk about materiality, we talk about sensibilities. I wonder if you can talk a little, I think some of the questions have already alluded in the relationship of design to history. So, we asked about the definition of Landschaft versus paysage, the particular origins. Maybe we can expand a little bit at that, and also relate it maybe to geological different slide.
But you mean design in landscape architecture, not in architecture?
Yes, design in general, because we also crossing disciplines.
And perhaps I can explain design is invisible. What did Lucius Burkhardt mean with design is invisible? As you can imagine, students, we arrive there into the book where you all learn how to design. This guy is invisible. Something explained as Saturday morning, then you go down, it's raining, you have to go to the university. In those days, you don't have a computer, you have to all draw by hand. It was all in the university. You go to the next kiosk to buy cigarettes, and then you wait for the bus. Now I have a question. What is more important, that the roof shelter is beautifully designed, or how this bus is coming? It's very obvious. And then in the end, he said, of course, if the bus is coming every 5 minutes, it's much better than every 10 minutes. But the roof shelter you should design in a good way. And with all these criteria we have today, in those days, it didn't have to be sustainable. But nowadays, my problem is sometimes, especially in architecture, it's a bit too much, too close to art. I see many projects, I don't criticize it's bad or so, but last week I asked an architect, but why is this shape? Why do you criticize? And say, I don't understand. I understand your idea, but so it's shaped like this and like that. Is it related to the space inside or the space outside? Okay, I didn't get, but this is such a specific shape. Why? And I just asked you why didn't I say? And this why question is more or less disappearing. And what I said, what I wanted to show is land art, and we are not artists, and but everybody can see it different. That's a big problem in architecture. It's sometimes like a peacock, you have to be more interesting than the neighbor, and so they are losing a bit the focus sometimes. Not all, of course, but sometimes I look at projects built or unbuilt. And that's what I did when we had the CTH. We had a studio. Of course, these Basel people couldn't be in Zurich, and we have the same problem like the French and the English. But then in the end, it was very interesting that Jacques Hertel, Pierre Demeron, Roger Guina, and Marcel Weile, they did a portrait of Switzerland and they were extremely criticized. I didn't criticize. But in the end, they told me there is one misconstruction. You know why? The last publication is attention to this. Jacques Hertel actually told me that's what you really, so the nice understanding is that you come to the end of our study for 10 years. That we found out how important the landscape is. But it's good, it's designed pretty, it's very good. And like Lucius Burkhardt, he did this Max Frisch, Lucius Burkhardt, and Markus Hutte. It's a title is coming from Attention Switzerland. And they propose that instead of having constantly this super interesting urban development, let's build a new city for the expo. A completely packed with all disciplines together, not the architect and the traffic planner and the landscape. Really, what is the idea of the future? So where you have the Bauausstellung, so for architects and the garden exhibition and so. But this was in the end 50s. And even the Basel guys, they found out in the end, and we did 3 or 4 semesters together. And it's very easy, you can complain about these ugly houses on the edge of the city, but it's not important. We have to think the cities from the landscape, not from being outside, so from outside in. How? Because this is really dynamic as well. looks like a landscape, and then we have a new motorway, a new train line, a new whatever infrastructure. And then after 20, 30 years, you have a landscape nobody really know who was responsible for. We were always responsible. And that's, I think, the job for all disciplines, not only architects and architects, just look from out into this. And especially here in Hong Kong, it could be. Here the regulations are very special. I don't know how it works, but I learned it's 25% is urban. 30. Much less. And when you see so in Milan, yes, again, they found out we really have to protect these park areas for the future, and define it not for a project, and this is nicer and this one. So really to, as a society, say, yeah, how much? Really, 100% should be completely green, whatever we need.
I think we'll take one more question and then we'll wrap up the meeting. Yeah.
In relation to the sort of shift of populations to urban areas, leaving in many places landscapes which are rewilding by themselves. If I understood you correctly, you said, well, we have to think about what we're going to do with these. Why do we have to think about what we're going to do with these? I mean, why do we have to do anything? If those landscapes are sort of returning to an altered form of wilderness, why shouldn't we just...
There is a very actual discussion in Italy. So a bear killed a joker in south of Tyrol. Now they have the court has to say, do we kill him now or do we leave him? And that's, it's not only when we say, yeah, it's abandoned, the forest is coming, wilderness, it means all is coming back. I mean, it's interesting. They're coming through France to Switzerland, and we tracked some wolves, and it's very interesting. They're exactly on the border between this wilderness and the urbanization. So that means it's very easy. Today they eat deer, and tomorrow they eat our ranch. So it's, and all this wild, and I heard here as well, this wild boars. This is really a question, and if people are killed, this is wilderness. And it's like in the Biennale, the question by the creator was, how will we live together? And I was really interested. We did an exhibition about this water issue. And then I wrote him an email, what do you mean? And then I said, I mean, I understand you. Crops, plants, animals, human beings. Does anyone agree? And that's a question in the future. When we talk about wilderness, it's not only beautiful, to be killed by a bear, it's not too much. And then now you get advices in Switzerland, you shouldn't flee. I don't know what else to do if you don't have a gun. This is the question. People living there, we have sometimes a very touristic view on landscape, and it's not so easy. Or in Italy, I know a beautiful landscape. It's 20 minutes drive by car outside of the city center of Genoa. So you park there, you do a walk, then and there is an abandoned village, a small town. And then this is a machine gun. This is private. Okay. But this is building land. That's the question for me. It's a question about how do we then develop in the future? And we leave all these questions open, and we should be more active. All disciplines, I think we should be much more active, and not to decide, not to do zoning and saying, you're here, you can do this, or you are not build, but so for instance, I criticize CTH studio council that they had some metropolitan areas, touristic hotspots, quiet zone, and so-called abandoned. And this was really gifting. This is Swiss identity. And they tell the people this is useless, abandoned, like an industrial area. And of course they were right. The problem is you cannot say 30 or 40% of the surface of Switzerland is abandoned. And then I could really understand people living there, but what is our future? And so, for instance, it's now very difficult to create in English. It's how do you translate wheelchair or something, not landscape or so, it's a very specific English expression. We have Cloudshot, meaning it's a landscape of the valley. We introduced it for Switzerland from the peak here, down. Then we said we should have a profile, and our students are doing it in a very good way. What is this valley for? Produce, for instance, this Chinese student, she proposes not to produce hydropower there, because then the lakes are too big. But to build a reservoir for drinking water, it's the scale for this shot is good. So say before even doing a program, sometimes it's overlapped, tourism, wilderness, whatever. And they do a profile. What do we think is the future? And then you have instead of 30% one color. And it's very interesting. And of course, they know with climate change, many of these tourist hotspots will disappear because they don't have enough snow. It's not cold enough. But what is the future? And if it's not coming from our discipline, geographers, we as geographers, we cannot produce images in you as designer. We want to see now images. How does this landscape look like in the future? And it's not a question of geography. This can do the profile, but not the ceremony designers. But wilderness is not so. It's a difficult expression.
Good. Okay. One announcement, since there's not a ton of students in the room, I want to say that you'll be joining us at 9:30 tomorrow morning in room 623 to talk about materials. So the students in the audience who want to join, who aren't already assigned to the class, please join. I want to thank you for your time and your thoughts today, and